Definitely, yes, I did know Mitchell. I was a great admirer of Mitchell. I considered Mitchell to be a man that was very forward. He was way ahead of his time. He was a guy that wouldn't ask you to do something that he wouldn't do himself. I recall very much an incident where there was a young officer that complained on maneuvers one day at Kelly that he didn't think that his DH-4, that was one of our observation airplanes at that time, was capable of carrying the military load under the flight conditions that existed that day. And Mitchell said to one of his aides when this man made the complaint to it, "Hold my coat." And he stripped his tunic off and handed it to him and told the young flight officer and said, "You put on my pants and make yourself decent here and I'll slip on your flying suit." And the old man, as we affectionately called him, he climbed in and flew the airplane. And he was the type of person, don't tell him he couldn't do anything, because he'd take the same equipment and show you that he could do it. Don't you?
You ever come in personal contact with him?
Oh, yes. I think about as near as I ever come busting all the buttons off my shirt was once he came by after a little performance I'd put on at Kelly and give me an affectionate pat on the shoulder and says, "A damn good job flying." So.
What was it like learning to fly back then?
In those days, there's very few aircraft that was capable of carrying two people due to their low horsepower and the inefficiency of the aircraft. So all of our training was started out by what we call grass cutting. Grass cutting was to put you in an aircraft and let you have part throttle. You didn't have power enough to do anything except, we might say, taxi the aircraft real fast like. That way you begin getting accustomed to the controls, being able to keep the aircraft going rolling in a straight line such as it would have to be held in on its initial takeoff. As you become more competent, proficient in the handling of the aircraft, more power was given to you by allowing the throttle to be pushed wider open. Setting was on it so it could be a little more power applied. This was gradually increased until such time that your aircraft was traveling at a rate sufficient to lift it off the ground a few feet. That way we accomplished the feel of the takeoff. It did not have quite power enough to sustain itself in the air, so it would gradually settle back, and we learned to land the aircraft in that way.
Didn't you feel just a little bit worried sometimes making even these short hops while you were learning to fly with no one in the plane with you?
No, actually, I never give it a thought. I never give it any consideration at all. In fact, the business is I never had anyone in an airplane with me until I had about 250 hours in the air.
Well, what did people prior to World War I think about anyone who would fly such a thing as an airplane then?
Well, people had the opinion in general that you were an idiot, and they were the opinion that even if you did have something like normal sense, that there had been some mental difficulty in the family somewhere up and down the line. They were sure that you wasn't a normal human being. None of them ever thought of it, or very few, in a scientific way. Rather amusing thing was that one time I did have an overheated engine and had an available spot to land in. Speaking about hazards, they're not all together. From the aircraft landed, and in the roll-up I came into the backyard of a small residence. I was immediately attacked by the occupant, an elderly lady with her parasol came out, and she said I disturbed her setting hens and was about to cause a mishap where the eggs wouldn't hatch or something of the kind. I like to got beat to death with a number of them.
Burrell, I suppose you've taught a lot of famous people to fly. Who stands out in your mind as probably the most famous?
Well, it's not particularly so what stands out in my mind, but it's those people that you have taught to fly that the public thinks of. I presume that from that viewpoint, that Wiley Post is the most outstanding person that I ever gave instructions to. Playing a little town of Wewoka, Oklahoma over here, and I had a parachute jumper, Mr. Pete Lewis, and he had jumped considerable that week, pretty well stove up, and he made me the proposition that he had a young man that would like to jump, and I didn't agree that I would take him up. The young man turned out to be Wiley Post, and Wiley did go up with me that day and make his first jump from my plane at Wewoka, Oklahoma.
He'd never jumped before then.
He had never jumped before. Wiley was average or above. At times you would think that he was slow, but once he grasped anything, it was firmly in his mind. There was no repetition of instructions whatsoever. Two things that were outstanding about Wiley Post is intense interest in aviation and his sincerity, and above all, he had no nerves. The man was born without nerves. Wiley Post didn't have any nerves. People talk about him not being nervous. He couldn't have been nervous because he had no nerves.
We hear a lot of stories that early day flying was very, very dangerous. Were there very many real hazards back in those days?
The greatest hazard we had, one of the greatest hazards we had, was that people were afraid that they wouldn't see you land. They were quite sure you were going to crash on landing. And crowds covered the available landing area. And another one of the great hazards was that the fair committees oftentimes charged to see the intrepid airman in the flying machine, the charge admission, to just come in, people see them, don't you see? And they would put you in enclosures, like half-mile racetracks surrounded by trees like that, where you had no choice of heading into the wind for takeoff or something like that. Crowded conditions, and both crowds on the field after you'd taken off and was tempting to get back in land. And not so much from a mechanical standpoint as you might think, or weakness in the aircraft.